I quickly,
Did you swim in the lake?
I didn't swim, I went fishing,
Mm-hmm.
which was wonderful.
Oh, nice. Yeah, the time we were there, it was warm enough to swim, and I felt like I'd never been in such clean water. Hi, Rob. It was so nice.
Very cold water.
Yeah, it is cold, yeah. Hello, good evening. I'm sorry?
Tom, you've changed. Tom, you've changed.
Good morning, hello. Do we dare ask one of our new members? if they
Yeah,
ask?
They're going to be recording
taped,
it
It'd be nice to have a break.
for, it won't be live.
Find you on the Amherst media website.
We should talk to Amherst Media about that. We don't have anything to do with it.
No, I know, it's not just organized.
Hi, Connie. How are you doing? Good evening. Yeah, I like your vest. Yeah. Well, you never.
Thank you.
Beautiful bylaw.
Thank you. Hot off the press?
Yep, there
Thank
you
you.
go.
Thanks, Chris.
Hi, Connie.
Stephen coming today, do you know?
Did you have a good vacation? Yes, I went to California. I went to Texas. Texas. Two places in Texas.
Oh, I just got one.
Oh, yeah, I just gave you one. I'm sorry.
thank you.
I'm being a little bit.
That's okay.
Okay, thank you. Texas. Must have been hot there. It was, especially in South Padre. It was really blast furnace in the mornings.
You never know what temperature it's going to be in here. Sometimes it's too hot, sometimes it's too cold.
Hey, I was here for 4.
Yeah, I think I'd be more comfortable. And it is cloudy out, too. Yeah, wish it would
Based on
rain.
my experience coming to your meeting.
Do you know if Steve is coming today?
I don't.
That's a good idea, yes. Yeah, I always have one around 4
Chris, do
o'clock.
you remember if Steve's going to be here? That's, well, yeah.
He sometimes flies in.
Ah, yes.
Fly in.
Sail.
Yeah.
We missed you at the gathering. That was very nice.
It's like waiting all year. He's like, I hope we do something in the summer. I almost was gonna offer my house, but then he didn't.
Everybody said they'd like to do it again, so absolutely. Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Turned out to be beautiful, which was really nice. Wasn't too hot. Last Wednesday. Temperature was very nice. It was comfortable to sit outside, which was really enjoyable.
Well, yesterday was.
It has been, yes. Yes. With the rain last weekend. Oh, that's nice. Yes. Because I've been seeing so many reports in the news about Dallas, especially, still being so hot. Yes.
South Padre Island is right near the Mexican border.
feel clean enough somehow. Yeah.
At least for the, I mean, you. So that was nice. I can.
Oh, nice.
Just the 1 hour. Get there all, I get there, I get the Austin. Travel.
Sounds like a nice trip. She's 90? Yeah.
I'm waiting for Chris. I assume she's coming back.
Yes, she is.
Stephen is going to be here according to my chart.
Okay, well, we're
Thank
going
you.
to start with Adam.
Okay.
Chris, are you ready? Chris, are you ready?
Oh, I'm sorry,
You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, good evening. We're going to start, okay. So welcome to the August 1st meeting of the zoning subcommittee. By way of announcement, I will note that the planning board at its last meeting asked this committee to focus on residential rental amendments for the fall. So that's what we're going to do. Also, at the last planning board meeting, we added 2 new members to this committee. So we welcome Connie Kruger and Stephen Schreiber if he shows up.
When he shows up.
Yeah, when he shows up, sorry. And now that we have a full board, I'd like to formalize the offices that we have and also establish a schedule for taking minutes. Traditionally, we've rotated the minutes taking among the non-presiding member. I'd like someone to volunteer this time and we can set up a schedule.
Sure.
You're willing to do this?
How come the members take the minutes instead of the staff, since the staff members are usually present, 1 or 2?
That's the way we've been doing it for the last couple of years. It's the staff takes minutes for the planning board following this, and it was just decided that it was a lot, and it was better for the members to be involved.
The reason I ask is it's very hard to participate in a meeting and also scribe
Yes.
and do minutes, so I didn't know what the evolution was of that history, so thank you.
I agree. It is difficult, and that's why we rotate so that one person is not stuck doing it all the time. But I mean, if one person wants to do it, or if we want to ask the staff to, we can do that. But otherwise, I'd inclined to just go along the way we've been doing it. So I guess what we'll do is at the next meeting we will elect officers and formalize the roles. Is that all right? Steve, we're talking about now that we have a full committee, formalizing the offices. I've been acting or interim chair since Jonathan O'Keefe left, but we didn't want to make a decision without everyone participating. So,
Sounds great.
Do you want me to take the notes for tonight?
if you would, please. So the first order of business is there any other announcements, by the way? First order of business is the minutes from last meeting.
I would note that you can decide whether or not to consider these. We received these fairly recently, and they were staff just went through and did some minor edits late this afternoon, did not have time to get those back to the author for review. So I would actually recommend that you spend a minute or two looking through these to decide whether or not they are an accurate representation of what you remember of the meeting.
Or we can postpone until next time.
That's an
That's
alternative.
okay, Jim, sure.
Any objection to postponing until next time, or? I haven't had a chance to read them, so I.
Next time will be fine, sure.
All right.
Seems like a waste of-
Okay,
Thank you.
so we'll, at the last planning board meeting, it was decided or requested that public comment on zoning amendments take place at planning board meetings to the extent possible, because the planning board is going to be much more involved than it has been in the past in considering zoning amendments and crafting them. So we're going to do public comment if we can today, but there will be time during the planning board for public comment, specifically on zoning. Okay, so the first item is residential rental amendments, 1 and 2 dwelling units. Mr. Tucker.
I would first of all point out in your packets a couple of additional sets of information. One is the full 2012 special town meeting schedule. We will be receiving a copy of this every time at every meeting with the previous meeting checked off, so that you have this sense of impending doom about how much time you have left, and to help you keep track of what's coming up and so forth. Additionally, there was a sheet provided that summarized all of the residential use categories that the zoning bylaw currently covers, so that you could identify those that are being proposed for amendment as opposed to those that are not. And there are some descriptions of the kinds of uses those are and the kinds of amendments that are being, in very gross terms, that are being proposed for each. It's just a way of keeping track of it. In terms of the first amendment, the 1 or 2 family dwelling amendment, as we have said in the past, the purpose of this is to distinguish between single-family dwellings or duplexes that are owner-occupied and that are, in essence, homes for the people who own and reside there, from potential rental properties, and that there are some distinctions made even among rental properties. For single-family residences, we are creating, or proposing to be created, a Class 1 and a Class 2 category. Under the Class 1 category, which would continue to be by right in all the places where it is permitted, we are including households that have at least one owner on the premises, a household renting the dwelling and consisting of an individual, a group of 2 or more persons related in the traditional family sense, or not more than 2 unrelated persons, except as provided for under the definition of functional family, which we will be considering later. And such a use would be eligible to be occupied by the accessory lodging and boarding uses which are already existing in the bylaw. So it is not simply to be exclusive to owner occupants and traditional families recognized in traditionally in law. It is meant to be a broader category than that, but with the intent that the Class 2 category would get at the principal source of the problem, which is single-family residences that are a residential use but are being operated as a commercial enterprise, essentially, for 3 to 4 persons, because that's the limit that's established here. And those uses would be by special permit in any residential zoning district. It also noted that those would be subject to all of the regulations of this bylaw and any other regulations enforced by the town, which would include any general regulations, general bylaws subsequently adopted, and all state regulations and codes. We're allowing for the possibility under this that the special permit granting authority might require the presence of an on-site resident manager as a condition of approval, but the language is may. It's not, as we always tried to do, we've tried to preserve judgment and flexibility in these so that when there are circumstances that warrant less stringent attention, that is a possibility. One of the things you don't want to do with zoning is to create a box out of which nobody can climb, and someone who ordinarily, or a use that's proposed that might ordinarily be something that no one would have a problem with, can find itself in that box and therefore unable to proceed. A similar set of changes are proposed for the duplex. These are also similar to what was proposed for the annual town meeting in 2011. Distinguishing between Class 1 duplexes where one of the units, one or both of the units are occupied by owners of the units, and Class 2 duplexes where neither unit is occupied by an owner-occupant. Again, the change for Class 2, which would be the new class, is that they would be by special permit in all circumstances. Under Class 1, where there was an owner-occupant, they would continue to be allowed by site plan review in the village center residence and the general residence districts. There are also definitions added to reinforce these two sets of changes. These are proposed at the moment to go forward together. They could be separated if the subcommittee and the planning board felt that made sense. We are also adding definitions for terms such as on-site resident manager and principal residence to help reinforce the use of those terms clarify the use of those terms in the proposed amendments.
Questions and comments from the committee? Go ahead. Go ahead.
I looked over these proposals really carefully, and I didn't know, I don't have the benefit of the history of this subcommittee, so if you folks will help me out, what the genesis was of wanting to do these changes. So I'm looking at this draft language, but I don't know if it was preceded by conceptual discussion. And for myself, as I started going through the menu of draft zoning language that we're going to be looking at over the next really couple of meetings, I tried to back up a little bit to a more conceptual place. What's the problem statement? What's the problem in the community that we're trying to solve? What data do we have about that problem? What solutions should be explored? And then will the solution being considered actually solve the problem, or what efficacy does that particular solution have? Are other communities in the Commonwealth doing that, or across the country? How complicated will a solution be to enforce or administer? And kind of, are there unintended consequences? So I'm kind of really fresh here with beginner eyes, and I don't know what the conversation was prior to looking at the draft language. We've seen a draft in our packets, I think the last meeting and prior, but are we just reacting to the draft, or has this come out of a discussion of the zoning subcommittee, this is a solution we really feel will solve a particular problem, and what it is?
Go ahead, do you want to answer?
I can speak briefly to the history. The duplex change was a response by the planning board to a couple of site plan reviews applications that it received following a change in the other direction that had preceded this, that the planning board had, for purposes of trying to pursue the master plan intent to allow for modest but greater density in existing built areas, changed duplexes, which are ostensibly, and we've heard evidence to the contrary, low impact residential uses by right in the densest residential districts we had. The reaction of the planning board after going through a couple of site plan review applications on this was that there were instances where there were problems created by potential problems created by a duplex that was not owner occupied. And so for the annual town meeting 2011, it proposed, and a copy of the planning board report describing that intent is included in your packet, to change in selected instances when there was owner occupancy or not owner occupancy, to change it back to a special permit in those zoning districts when owner occupants were not present. That was one piece. The other piece came out of a discussion with town council in an attempt to respond to the burgeoning acquisition of single-family dwellings and their conversion into rentals, over which we had no zoning control. Now, it can be argued whether or not we should have zoning control if we have other controls in place, but there were no zoning controls. And town council said, well, you know, it might well be possible to consider a single-family residence to be operating as a commercial enterprise under certain circumstances and to regulate it distinctly from other single-family residences. So this language with regard to that aspect of the amendment is new. It's not something the zoning subcommittee or the board has previously examined. It's not something town council has yet examined. And part of the process now is to go through it and take a look at it and see if there are issues with it, better ways to do it, whether or not it makes sense to do it this way, and so forth. That aspect of this is new. The duplex aspect is older.
So and to follow up on that, the zoning subcommittee has not drafted any of this language. This language arose from staff out of a consensus of the committee about what sorts of problems need to be worked on. And so we do not necessarily have to adopt this language. It's a starting off point. If you have a different suggestion for proceeding, we can try that.
I wanted to be respectful of the background. I would like us to discuss the two parts as if they were separate. We don't have to decide if they're separate or not. My comments about one are really somewhat different
By two parts,
than the other. The single family versus the duplex. And again, going back, the problem statement, I mean, I think I know the problem because we've heard a lot of testimony. I don't know the data. We had some data on one particular neighborhood presented by a resident a couple of weeks prior, but I don't know if we have equivalent data for other neighborhoods, because when we talk about making a change to a zoning district, we're talking about a much larger geographic area than 2 or 3 neighborhoods. So I don't know what the whole body of data is, but I do see the single family issue very differently than the duplex, because everyone puts themselves in a position. So if I have to go to Austin, Texas to take care of my mother for a year, and I want to rent out the home that I own and live in, I would be under these very stringent new restrictions. And so whenever we have a solution, we're trying to address one problem, but we're also regulating a whole lot of other stuff, and we have to balance that. So that's why I want to talk about them separately, because I think the impacts are really different on residents and current owners in the town.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd love to hear other people's opinions, because I don't want to be the only one talking.
Yeah. Anyone else on the committee? I had that same question about what if you're transferred out of town and you're unable to sell your house? Are you not allowed to rent it? Could that special permit be denied?
2 unrelated people only, or a special permit in order to rent your house out?
So,
Exactly. That's,
It's on the table, yeah.
Put the pieces out so we can see what makes sense and what doesn't, and test it. And there are a number, if I may, a number of recommendations have been made that are also in your packet and have been made previously, that some of these issues, in some cases most of the issues that would be associated with a specific use, the rental of a single family, so forth, might be taken care of predominantly through another mechanism besides zoning entirely. However, the reason this is before you is because what you work on is zoning, and so the question came up, is there some way we can address this through zoning? And if so, how much of it should we address and how much not? And that's what this is intended to explore.
So I'm bringing it up because we may not want to invest a lot of time in part one if we think that's not a route to pursue, or maybe we want to talk about a general bylaw around rental registration and where we stand on that before we, I mean, they're interrelated, but the planning board does have a role in recommendations around general bylaws, although it has a different capacity than zoning. So, I know that the department had done a lot of research on rental registration systems in the past, so
Yes.
if we're looking at an incremental approach where that's first line of regulation, then I don't know if we want to tighten every other aspect of zoning right now, but.
Bruce?
I had the same thought about maybe starting with the rental registration, and is there something we need to do? I know we've talked about the Board of Health would handle this, and the police department and so forth, but is there an aspect that we need to work with them, or is this something that they would handle entirely separately?
So I join the rest that are struggling with the single-family house, because I do think that enforcement would solve a huge part of the issue. So when 4 actually means 4, I think is really what the issue is. But I also can think of ways to make, the kind of the time out of town, the transfer, the sabbatical workable, which is that if it's your primary residence that you rent out, then you're exempt for this. But if it's not your primary residence, then you fall under this guideline. And that's a simple checking of, really I guess it's a property card, right, that has the homestead, or whatever, isn't there a checkbox for principal? I'm
I
trying to
remember the
yeah.
property cards. Don't
But
remember.
there's a way of checking that. But I do think that there's another standard of care if it's your actual house that you're renting out to somebody versus a commercial enterprise. I think that those are really different issues.
If I may, as drafted, and again, I have no investment in this. This is Lincoln Logs, pull things in, put things out. As drafted, the standards and conditions under Class 1, which is the exempt, the way we treat single-family dwellings now, reads that a Class 1 single-family detached dwelling shall be a residential use which serves as the principal residence for, and then goes on to list the various categories. And then later on, there's a definition of principal residence, which is a cumulative set of evidence to be determined on by the zoning enforcement officer or the permit granting board, so that what you're describing, that exemption exists now in the language. It would require process, and I think that's maybe part of the concern.
Mr. Tuckerbett, on the, are you talking where it says, which serves as a principal residence for, and then it says, can be rented to not more than 2 unrelated people, except as provided for under the definition of functional family. So unless it's a functional family, even if it's my principal residence, I would be limited to 2 unrelated persons, but perhaps I'm reading this wrong.
If it's, well, let's explore that range of possibility. 2 unrelated persons are presumed either to be a couple in relation, or no more than 2 people, which has a relatively low impact. A family that is a traditional family is already under here, whatever that means. And a functional family is presumed to capture the rest of the households that function as a family.
Okay. So I think we're getting it, sorry, Mr.
Okay.
Chair. I think we're getting into the slippery slope, because it assumes that we're gonna, where we're gonna land on functional family, and you're making assumptions about who's gonna live where, and what 2 unrelated or related people mean, and you said assume it will be a couple or. So I can think of lots of scenarios that are plausible low-impact acceptable in every neighborhood configurations that aren't captured in this. And what I'm really worried about is that this is way too constrained for people who just own houses and go about their business as they do now with lots of options. I understand the student rental impact on neighborhoods, and I really respectfully appreciate all the information we've gotten, but I just don't want us to be using a missile instead of a finely aimed arrow at what we're getting at, because we're all going to have to live with these constraints, whether the situation fits the problem or not.
Is the committee considering discussing a general bylaw about rental permitting or rental registration itself, or are we hoping that somebody else is going to do it?
I'd like to hear what the 7 o'clock presentation has to say, because right now it's under the Board of Health. So, you know, I'd just like to hear where that's going, because I know that's part of the Safe and Healthy Communities Act also.
I can give you a bit of a preview on that. I don't know that all of what will be presented at 7, but what I can say is that the staff body that's been working on this for about 2 years has had in mind, working with the town manager, has had in mind an incremental approach to accomplishing many of the things that have been recommended in the citizen proposals that we've received. You know, creating an effective rental registration and regulation system for the town that operates outside of zoning. Given the scale of what exists in Amherst, we have been pursuing this in an incremental fashion, and there is not, I don't believe there is an intent to have that full system up and running and all the pieces adopted by town meeting until at least next spring, and maybe after that, just because there are so many pieces and it is such a large ocean liner to try and turn in terms of the way that the town has handled this issue. Right now, this is not in the hands of anybody except the staff. Staff have been working on it. The Board of Health is interested, but actually doesn't believe in preliminary conversations, and I don't want to characterize what they would do too far here, but preliminary conversations, they didn't feel that there was a compelling public health issues associated with that. It's not the problems that the community experiences are not public health problems, except under certain circumstances. They are larger issues having to do with neighborhood character and so forth. So the planning board and the zoning subcommittee could, if it decided to, pick up that torch. It would be a large effort, I promise you. But right now, there is not a town-appointed body that is doing that work. It is being done by staff. And the exploration and the groundwork and the research and so forth is being done by staff.
So are you saying that, you said there was a lot of pieces, and it wouldn't be fully implemented for another possibly a year or so?
Right.
Are you saying that none of it would be implemented for that long, or some of it might come in the fall, some of it come in the spring, and some of it come next month?
The latter, that pieces of it would come in, starting with some of the low-hanging fruit, the corresponding, for instance, regulations addressing residential rental parking, which is a significant issue in some neighborhoods, to complement and reinforce what the town meeting passed this spring in terms of the zoning bylaw would be something that would be brought. There's the possibility of pursuing, and this was on the list for your information last time we were talking about potential amendments, a nuisance property bylaw to correspond to the nuisance house bylaw. The nuisance house bylaw really just addresses parties and underage drinking. That's really what it is about. The nuisance property bylaw could establish basic standards addressing public health and safety issues with the maintenance and upkeep of properties. There will be, you can imagine what some of the responses to that will be, but that is the intent. And those are two of the pieces, parking and how the exteriors are being kept and in safe ways. The current health codes already address the interior of buildings. You have to find them and get in them. One of the challenges in proceeding with a full-blown rental registration system is you have to get everybody in the system. You have to identify where all the rental properties are. You're asking for about mapped information that corresponded to some of the information that Mr. Karlstrom presented. We do currently have a mapping of all rental properties in Amherst available as a GIS layer. So we have that information available. I don't know that it is currently done according to time, that you would be able to sort of phase it in and look at the change over time. We probably could do that with some programming. But we can take a snapshot and tell you that, within the last few months, this is what all of the rental properties in Amherst look like and where they are and so forth.
And how is that done, by property cards?
That's right. We're using the assessor's data, which is not complete. It's as complete as we have, though.
And does the staff who is working on this perceive a difference between a rental registration system and a rental permitting system?
No.
Okay, so they see
Each
that
is
as
both the same. They're intended to be the same thing.
Okay.
You register, and once you are registered, would be a set of expanded regulations that would address how you have to operate a rental property in Amherst.
And with the implication that if you fail to meet those, your registration or your permit can be revoked in some way,
Yes.
by some process.
Yes, but although that would, as in all cases with violations, begin with fines and identification of violations, going to court. We could mimic, as other communities do, a certain number of violations and you're done for 2 years or something like that. Given the frequency and rapidity with which people can create new financial entities, however, corporate entities, that might be chasing a will-o'-the-wisp.
Chris?
I went to a recent meeting of the Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods Group to talk to the building commissioner and the code enforcement officer and the health director about their presentation to the planning board tonight. And I had the impression from talking to them that they were interested in working on a kind of soft opening for the rental registration / permitting process, and that they were proposing, and nobody has yet decided that this is going to be the way it is, but that they were proposing to reach out to all rental, people who are renting units now, and offer them an opportunity to register without paying a fee. And they had a form that they were encouraging people to fill out, and they were going to put this form online. So I think, although the complete full-blown rental registration and rental permitting process will not be in effect until some months or maybe a year down the road, I think the intent is to start the ball rolling fairly soon and try to have a kind of soft and friendly approach in the beginning, and that will capture quite a number of rental units.
I would like to hear the staff who are working on this present tonight, so I don't have a fully formed version, but I'm a little concerned that if the health department is the lead and the Board of Health doesn't see this as a pressing health issue, which it may not be, and it is a pressing planning issue and zoning related matter, that the planning board have some involvement as this goes along. I'm less concerned about getting everything registered than what are the conditions for getting a license, enforcement, penalty, how do you lose your license, and sort of the sort of teeth of what it will be when it's full blown. And I'm concerned about something that's been worked on for 2 years that so far has been just staff, and I think it's time for the policy-making boards to get involved, because I think they really carry the day politically. Some major boards do have to get involved, and I don't exactly know the role for the planning board, but I have a concern that we're going to roll something out and there hasn't been policy involvement from a major board. And just, this is more a technical thing, but Mr. Tucker, in a number of your drafts, you talk about required rental registration by the Board of Health, and it might make sense to say required rental registration under the Town of Amherst rental registration program, because it could change, and it could even start out with Board of Health, and we don't know. And it's really the Town of Amherst rental registration program, if we have one, or currently this very soft version evolving to be something over time. So after we listen tonight, we may want to consider recommending to the full board to stay really tuned into rental registration.
Okay, do we want to discuss this anymore? Do you want to move on to another aspect of residential use?
Note a minor detail, I think that there's reference to NAVC and AC at the end of the
Yeah.
list, and so those should be taken off so they don't confuse
Survivors.
anybody, yeah.
Kind of a
Okay.
earmark. Get that passed through earmark.
It's difficult for us to hear, and we're trying very hard to follow your thinking so that we can, when we make comments later, won't be behind the ball. So we really missed a lot of the kind of mumbled comments.
Have the new microphones not yet arrived, is that it? Everybody lives in Pittsburgh, that they got to put down meeting. You hear the officials put down your fellows.
I think we're going to have to give out headphones to everyone.
He's speaking to the microphone.
Speak louder. Connie is not
sorry.
using the microphone at all.
I will speak louder, I promise.
But you keep forgetting to put it back.
Christine, we
Okay.
really wanted to hear what you said
About,
about something that was wrong, they were wrong in here.
oh,
she was
the
re-
reference to NAVC and AC. There is no NAVC or AC yet as far as zoning districts, so.
We really followed you closely.
You want us to identify ourselves?
Please, there's a microphone too. I don't want to take a lot of public comment, but if you have a, it is.
Louis Greenbaum, Precinct 1. We're all here, obviously, because we're anxious to hear what the planning board and the subcommittee particularly are thinking about. And I endorse so much of what I've heard this afternoon from Connie Kruger, suggesting, again, if I heard her right, that there's got to be some kind of causal relationship and some kind of a linkage between what we perceive to be real problems in rental housing and in the neighborhoods, which is our problem. That is our problem. That is where our focus should be. But there's no sense telling you you'd have to wait until town meeting before you'd be able to make these kinds of connections. And the reason for that, it strikes me when I read all of the memos about the subjects that you people are deliberating and studying, some of them run directly, fly in the face of fundamental rights, fundamental property rights, fundamental constitutional rights, fundamental privacy rights. You know, I read this. I have read one of these with regard to what is a family. And the students will be asked to assume responsibility for paying their share of the rent and for paying their share of the utilities and other kinds of expenses. Well, who's to say that they're not doing that right now? Because largely they sign leases and are obliged by law to conform with these provisions. So that's all I'm saying is that I think it would be well in our thinking, your thinking and discussion to make sure that the causal premises here have been clearly stated and clearly brought forth. That is to say, how are the zoning proposals that you wish to make, the housing registrations that you wish to make, the other kinds of zoning changes that you are going to propose, how are they going to improve what the situation is? I'd like to make it very clear, too, that while many of us are mortified and downright displeased by what we have to read about the conditions of privacy and quiet of our neighbors and friends in the various neighborhoods of Amherst. There is nothing unique about the situation in Amherst, Massachusetts. As a matter of fact, I rather think that it's tame compared to any of the cities of the Big Ten universities in the Midwest. I was a student in Madison, Wisconsin, and in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I can assure you there are grievances aplenty. Say nothing about Boston with you know, a large university population, a huge university population. So that's really all I would like to say now. I'm following whatever you propose to us with a tremendous amount of interest, wishing you a great deal of success. But I think as long as you can make clear to us why there is an urgency about what it is that you're addressing yourself to, your chances for success and the success for all of us in the community will, I think, be correspondingly enhanced.
Do you want to proceed on to
Yes.
converted dwelling? or
Yes,
is there
please.
more? Connie was.
Did anyone have anything about about the duplex aspect? Because there were two parts to the 1 and 2 family dwelling changes, and in the 2 family, it seemed like it was a little bit of a different situation, because I think we're looking at the Class 1, Class 2 duplex proposal or drafted proposal. So I didn't know if people had comments about that. But I think and this is, I think what you were talking about, Mr. Tucker, historically, about having moved the bar to a more, I don't want to say liberal, but a different permitting, by right permitting route, now looking at pulling that back to a special permit.
In certain
Permitting is for the Class
circumstances.
2 duplex, and I just had a few comments on that one. One was, there used to be a permitting category called Special Permit Planning Board, and I looked through the use chart, and apparently that doesn't exist anymore
No,
because.
it still exists. It applies principally to development methods rather than use categories. And it also applies to dimensional modifications to uses that are by site plan review approval. And so we're always trying to line those up, where if you have to have a special permit for changing the dimensional aspects of a specific use, then you want it to be done by the same board that's granting the permit for the use.
Because in some of the written comments that people sent in, and where they were urging the Zoning Board of Appeals to issue special permits for conversions, I think it was, the reasoning was that they wanted that to be a discretionary permit where the applicant would have to show benefit or lack of negative impact, rather than feeling like the neighborhood was on defense coming in on a by right use. And so I was just wondering if using Special Permit Planning Board as an interim way to take away the by right but leave the planning board as the review board might be a way to, at least for now, modify the way things were going.
Staff would have no problem with that. Amherst is unique in the number of use categories that it has by special permit, period, and having special permit through the Zoning Board of Appeals, which is an appeals body, second. We have in the past made that proposal. It is usually turned into an arm wrestling session with the ZBA, and rather than having that distraction, we had, for the purposes of bringing this forward for discussion, simply had it special permits be by the body which has done most special permits in Amherst. I'm perfectly happy to have it be a planning board special permit, in any number of other instances as well.
So, I really like this idea because I've been struggling with, when one of the SPRs for a duplex was coming before us, the question came up, would it actually be easier for this particular applicant to go through the zoning board of appeals? Go through the zoning board of appeals because of various reasons. It's fewer people to convince is one reason. So there's, zoning board of appeals currently requires a vote of 3, and for the planning board currently would require a vote of 6 is that right?
5 of 9.
5,
6 if you're dealing with a planning board special permit.
yeah.
Okay.
5 if you're dealing with, or one majority if you're dealing with a
But
site plan review.
I think that, because really what Class 2 is proposing is that we go back to the previous, the way that it used to be for everyone except for owner-occupied duplexes. But I think that this compromise, it takes away the by rightness, but still, I don't know, it seems like a good idea to pursue.
I wonder, though, that even allowing a conversion or a duplex by special permit is not enough for what some people want. In other words, a special permit does not mean that it can just be denied because there's not an owner there. I think a lot of people would want additional language that says if it's not owner occupied, it can be denied. And we heard last week from Mr. Ergo that's not sufficient for a no. So I don't think that if it's a special permit, regardless of who does it, I don't know that that's going to be enough
Yeah.
for some people.
Well, if I may, as Ms. Kruger has pointed out, there are multiple populations being served here, and some of them, while on the one hand we want to deal with essentially commercial rentals in a specific range of ways, and on the other hand we want to be able to allow people to go on sabbatical or deal with a family emergency and so forth, and not have to go through the same kind of rigor. And there are places in between. When we were looking at, for instance, the Gateway area and doing an analysis of that area, there was a blend of what were essentially lodging houses, as has been described by a number of people, for students on the one end, single-family residences, owner-occupied on the other, and many residences occupied by their owners and rented out to lots of students, in some cases more than the law would allow. So there are multiple populations to be served in this, and it's not just an issue of changing neighborhood character. Neighborhoods change. The question is whether or not we need to have a range of possible responses as well, including permit options. You're right, there are some people who would want, for instance, the ownership of single-family residences or duplexes in Amherst by financial entities other than, I don't know what, to be illegal right now, because there's a perceived problem created by that. That's not something we can do. It's not legal. It doesn't make long-term sense for the community. On the other hand, there are people who, and in fact a community majority, as expressed in the master plan, who want new residential density to go into existing centers and the adjacent neighborhoods rather than sprawling out into the open lands that remain in Amherst. They all have to be served in some way, and it's a balancing act. You can't just respond to each set of needs. You have to respond to all of them, which is part of the joy of trying to do this.
I just want to make 2 more quick comments since we're just reviewing the draft, and then I don't want to go on. The on-site resident manager, I think for a duplex, that's just not realistic. I just think you don't have a resident manager for 2 units, and I think when you make something unrealistic, then it encourages cheating. And the other thing, you have a this is the last part of the last paragraph on the second page. The primary current domicile of the individual household or owner as indicated by their continual uninterrupted residence for a period no less than 9 months per year. Durational requirements have often been tossed out, and they're very hard to enforce, and I'm not sure I'm not a lawyer, but I think if we can stay away from any durational requirements in our zoning, we'll fare better.
That's fine with me.
So I took your opening comments about defining what the problem is, and does this proposed solution actually address that problem? That's where my comments were about how a lot of people want to prevent these conversions entirely, and so changing who the permitting body is doesn't do that. It's actually changing the permitting, the permitting standards. That's what people want. And so I'm not sure that I think that's right. I think you have an excellent point that and Mr. Tucker, that there's a range of populations that are being served here. And furthermore, I thought that I understood your inclination to wait to hear from the building commissioner tonight before we proceed to apply both to 1 and 2 family dwellings. I think they are related. So, go ahead, Ms. Greenbaum. Could you go?
Trying to chair hearings when there has been quite a bit of conflict between 45 neighbors.
Microphone.
Oh, sorry, I'm hearing my own microphone. A conflict between 45 neighbors and a property owner. One of the problems is that a garage was like 10 feet within 10 inches within the required 10-foot setback. Well, I'll tear down the garage and I will go to planning board, presumably because Chapter 11 of the site plan review is a lot less rigorous than 10.38. That's one of the problems. So I want you to try to avoid pitting one board against the other. And then I've also run into the problem of an owner-occupied requirement on a 3-family house. What is that status of that house when it goes, number one, on the market for sale? Is it a bona fide 3-family house? Must it be owner-occupied? A person puts a deposit down on the house and we deny the permit for the 3-family house and require it to be owner-occupied. So here's a 3-family house. They can have 4 unrelated into it. So as Connie probably knows, when I was an assessor 25 years ago, we were paid assessors, and we went around to every neighborhood in town with the property record cards to see if they were correct, and even going around North Amherst today. There really is not a difference between owner-occupied and rental properties. You got a couple of bad apples of both. In other words, most of the properties, most of the landlords, I think, in this town are very responsible in maintaining their properties. We got a few bad apples. And the same goes for owner-occupied. That, I can tell you how many times I've fallen in big holes in people's backyards that I characterize as a branch of the town dump. But they're owner-occupied. And so I really question the efficacy of dividing things up into class 1s and class 2 and just make all duplexes come under one board or the other board, but not one or the other. I mean, I sort of think that all duplexes, there's only one category, and that's the general residence duplexes, which are allowed by right, unless they're non-conforming, in which case they come to the zoning board. And that really doesn't seem entirely fair because they are regulated differently. So I really think that all duplexes should come to the zoning board of appeals. And the whole owner-occupied thing, I think, opens a can of worms. And I like the idea of a town bylaw whereby even single-family homes owner-occupied, if people don't mow their grass, then they can be handed a ticket for a $100 fine or whatever. I know 2 people working in a household or single family or whatever, lots of times they don't have time to mow their lawn. As I go around neighborhoods, Redgate Lane and Hills Road, which I know for years ago, everybody took great pride in their gardens. Well, people don't have time for that anymore. So dividing things up may not necessarily make sense for the 21st century the way it did 50 years ago. And I guess at this point, the other thing I keep thinking about, which I'm sort of here as a ZBA person observing, but these ideas have been bothering me too as chairing hearings. The whole issue of grandfathering, if you make things zoning bylaws, then anything that's currently existing is gonna be unregulated. Single-family homes with 6 people in it are gonna continue to be unregulated, where if you can come up with a town bylaw for the nuisance properties, for mowing the lawns and behavior and what else, then it would be effective immediately. And that's sort of what I'm hearing tonight as I listen, that you're not gonna solve anything by making new bylaws because the horse is already out of the barn. That's what I'm thinking at this point.
Shall we move on to converted dwellings now? Oh, go ahead. Oh, is there something? Oh, sure. I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
Just a short comment, Maureen Adams, Precinct 10, about the ZBA. I mean, what I have found very valuable as an observer of the ZBAs, that once we remove the by right language, which I think you're considering, and I really am very happy about that, the 3.0 language that they use to make decisions is very clear-cut, and it's really something that neighbors can speak to at a hearing. And so there is a visibility and a kind of publicness to that I think it would be well to be consistent using the ZBA for all such questions. The second, just speaking, Ms. Kruger, to your specific point about the duplexes, I agree with you in principle, but we are, as you know, dealing with duplexes that by virtue of 4 unrelated people being a family, we have 8 unrelated people there. 8 unrelated students living in a duplex on Lincoln Avenue or Sunset Avenue are kind of attracting lots of other people on weekends and on the evenings. And so they're actually functioning as a boarding house. And so for that reason, given the kind of boarding house slash duplex slash owner occupied language, I am beginning to think that the language of permits as a bylaw will fit the range of behaviors that we're trying to manage more effectively than the zoning language. This is not something I felt a few weeks ago, but as I listen to you and study this and try to think what will address the problem, I think it's going to be permitting language that addresses the accountability of owners and landlords who may not be living in the residences, regardless of the size of the house. Thank you.
I would just note as a point of information that whoever is granting the special permit uses the same criteria, the same findings. If it's the planning board issuing a special permit, they must go through 10.38, just as the ZBA. And that's something else the planning board has been working on, is the question of how do we make, maybe there's a way to make all of these findings and criteria apply to everything, with the only distinction being that something is by right or discretionary. But that's, given the urgency of these, we'll have to work on those maybe for the spring or later. I just wanted to provide that.
Go ahead and identify yourself. Come up and identify yourself.
I'll just take a minute of your time. My name is Kenneth Rosenthal. I live at 53 Sunset Avenue. I'm a former member of the Zoning Board of Appeals, and I'm its former chairman. So I understand the responsibility you have in considering changes to the town zoning bylaw, and I just want to speak to some basic principles, if you'll permit me. Amherst is fortunate, and I'll leave this statement with you. Amherst is fortunate to have many beautiful old residences occupied by many wonderful families in residential districts close to the university. The town has always looked with favor upon families living in close proximity to the university in relatively high densities. Two-family dwellings occupied by resident owners are and should be welcome here. Where the ZBA has discretion to approve a two-family or multiple family dwelling, the law requires that it consider how the proposed use will affect the character of the community and be harmonious with its surroundings. And I fear that this has not always been an element in the forefront of their consideration. And you must apply the same consideration as you consider bylaw changes. Each time a multiple dwelling use near the university is approved with absentee ownership, the residents tend to be students, and consequent environmental and behavioral changes that are all too familiar inevitably displace traditional families, and the neighborhood is degraded. Each such change makes it harder to maintain the traditional character of the neighborhood, decreasing the likelihood that when nearby properties are offered for sale, traditional families with children will be interested in buying here. It will make it more likely that sellers will have no one to sell to but absentee owners who seek to crowd the dwellings with tenants. Nearby property owners will then tend to seek real estate tax reductions and as the values of their properties fall. And even as the town receives less tax revenue, the town's costs go up, as police are called out more often in hopes of keeping some semblance of Saturday night peace. You may hope that this doesn't happen, but you know it will. And it's no answer to say that the town's laws and enforcement officers can manage the situation. History shows that they have not, and we should not expect that they can. Please don't think that rezoning is controlled only by amendments proposed by the planning board and approved by town meeting. In practical fact, whenever the ZBA grants a special permit or otherwise consents to a change of use, it's as if rezoning has occurred. This is rezoning by accretion over time, rezoning without the vote of our town meeting. And when owners are unable or unwilling to follow the requirements of the zoning bylaw or the conditions imposed on them by the ZBA, that is rezoning by neglect or zoning by broken promises. So whenever you propose language for zoning bylaw changes, please consider how it will be applied and how it will be enforced. And I have a specific instance I want to give to you. The notion that a family might be defined as up to 4 unrelated individuals certainly has some appeal. It means, of course, that a two-family house might have up to 8 college-age adults in residence. Those numbers, without more, are imposition enough. But on my street this spring, when an absentee landlord proposed changing the status of a residence from a 1 to 2 family residence, and the ZBA inspected the premises, 4 bedrooms were seen, but 3 other rooms were locked and could not be inspected. Tenants admitted to the neighbors what the applicant would not or could not admit to the ZBA, that there already were 7 residents in that single-family house. And even if there are just 4 bedrooms in a single-family house, students can easily bring in additional roommates to share the rent without the landlord's permission or knowledge. Please recognize that. Then consider changing the definition of a family to not more than 3 or even 2 unrelated individuals. It won't solve all problems, but it will help. And Ms. Kruger, I think we can find ways to deal with the problem posed by a sabbatical or a person who wants to leave for a year or 2 for family business, who intends to come back, and because that person, we can presume, is also going to want to have the same qualities of experience in that residence while he or she is gone than while he or she is living there. And I think we can write rules that cover that. It's been said that there are threats to property rights that are constitutionally protected, but it's well established, and I know from my experience as ZBA member and chairman, long established, that we can write these regulations as proposed without running into constitutional problems. One more point, and that's about the commercial climate of the town is affected by these changes. Residential degradation affects the commercial center of town too. Just this month, 2 more storefronts are becoming vacant. Students tend to come to town for food and drink. Families have different retail needs, and over the past decades, families have been taking their business to the highway in Hadley. Encouraging more families to reside within walking distance of the center of town will encourage the demand for stores that used to be found here: the shoe store, the hardware and small appliance store, and clothing stores for men, women, and children. Our best protection for the preservation of the character and quality of life of our residential neighborhoods and in Amherst as a whole is a good zoning bylaw proposed by you, adopted by town meeting, and a vigilant zoning board of appeals that recognizes the limitations of absentee ownership and is realistic in applying its legal discretion when applicants come before it. And I thank you very much for listening to me. I appreciate it very much.
Comments?
I'm afraid if we stay on this for too much longer, we won't get to some of the other things, but at some future time, I'm hoping we will talk quite thoroughly about family definition and whether we want to change it or not. But we all come from our own personal history, and I spent a number of years being what would be considered not a family when I was a family. And so I think we need a full airing of what related and unrelated and family means, and I don't think tonight will give us the time to do that.
Okay, we can start out with that next time, possibly.
It's fine with me.
Shall we move on to converted dwellings? Any objection? Okay. Can you introduce for us?
I think we went over this briefly last time. There are at least two principal changes that the amended language would achieve. One of those is to make a clearer distinction between a conversion and any other kind of residential use, and to define that around the conversion of existing dwellings or buildings that are not being used for residential uses, and their conversion into square footage that is being used as a residential use. We have some proposed percentages on that: no more than 20% of the gross square footage of habitable space in a converted dwelling use, that is new space, whether in one or more buildings, may be the result of demolition of an existing structure, including structural elements or foundation, and subsequent reconstruction with new materials. Essentially, we're saying that not less than 80% of the gross square footage of the habitable space in a converted dwelling has been created through the conversion. We were trying to put a limit on the amount of new construction that can happen, that if this is conversion, it is principally the result of the conversion of existing structures. It doesn't prevent additions and renovations from occurring, but what it does is not, through this particular use category, create a doubling and a trebling of the amount of square footage created. There's an issue that just came up in a recent special permit case that we are also attempting to address here. There are a number of thresholds in the current language that are established that determine whether or not a converted dwelling use can be pursued. One of them is the date of construction, original construction of any structure on a property where an existing dwelling already exists, and this principally refers to outbuildings. And the other is that the conversion of such structures, of detached structures, would have to have an exterior footprint of at least 500 square feet. We recently had an instance where there was a detached structure for which someone applied to have it be a converted dwelling, but it was smaller than 500 square feet. And because these pieces were not lined up, and because there was no reference to one another in the bylaw, the ZBA had to determine that the proposed conversion did not meet the threshold. That is to say, it was not at least 500 square feet in size. Increasingly, there is an emphasis, for reasons of sustainability, on smaller and smaller dwellings. It has its own movement afoot, and not that I'm proposing this or that it would make sense in Amherst, but living quarters as small as 75 square feet are being built, designed and built. Generally speaking, smaller structures of these kinds that are the design of which is being pursued as both an affordable way to create housing and as a sustainable way to create housing where you're not chewing up a whole lot of land, are not greater than, not having as the minimum as, but not greater than 500 square feet in size. There's a wide range of types that are out there. So for the purposes of discussion, at least, in this amendment, which was just amended today under number 8 in the conditions, standards and conditions. We're proposing to change the language from a minimum exterior footprint of at least 500 square feet to 300 square feet, which is a modest size, which is within which the majority of small houses, as so named, fall, and that square footage exists at the time of application rather than have existed since 1960, at least 1964, so that a person could have the option of expanding an outbuilding for the purposes for which it was originally created, and then later coming in and deciding that they wanted to convert it to a residence without difficulty.
Actually, two points. So at some point, you also get into Board of Health, like State Board of Health,
Yes.
plus building code regulations which define minimum sizes for, and also minimum characteristics of a dwelling. So
Per person, yeah.
per person, right? So like no room can be less than 7 feet or 8. I can't think of what it is off the top of my head. So that'll be interesting to see if that can happen. And
Yeah, the 300 put here as a placemaker.
yeah,
We're going to consult with the building commissioner. We didn't have time to do that today.
Yeah.
And the health director to look at those figures.
so in every dwelling must have a kitchen, must have a bathroom, must have a blank. So that'll be interesting to see how that all pans out.
Yes.
The other question is the Hawthorne Farm example. So I went to the presentation where the possibility of converting one of the barns into a dwelling to make a third unit on that property. Would this enable that, or would this?
I don't know what the relationship of this would be to that. My understanding of the Hawthorne Farm report was that neither of the outbuildings was particularly amenable. One of them was absolutely not amenable, and the other of which was
Also absolutely not.
problematically amenable to the conversion to something else.
Well, I think the question was like George Washington's axe, where you replace the handle on the head. Is it still George Washington's axe?
Right.
So in other words, if you
Exactly.
take down the barn, but save the materials or save the air rights or the airspace and rebuild it exactly as close to it as you can that fit into this?
As drafted, no. If you want it to, sure. It's words. We
Yeah.
can make it be what it needs to be.
Well, I think that,
Part of the intent here, if I may, and we have always 17 million different sets of interests scrambling for space on this. Part of the intent here is to not encourage the destruction of existing historic fabric, but to encourage its reuse. That might apply even to outbuildings, and depending on what they were. Not to argue with that, with the notion that there ought to be enough flexibility to essentially disassemble a structure and then rebuild it on essentially the same footprint. The converted dwelling use has historically not encouraged that. It has discouraged demolition and reconstruction. It has, under circumstances, because it has been vaguely worded enough, allowed fairly extensive additions on existing buildings that were not existing fabric. What this attempts to do, rightly or wrongly, is limit the amount of absolute new construction on the ground, expanded footprint.
so just one last
No,
point, and
no,
then
no.
I'll yield.
Okay.
But so in the case of the Hawthorne Farm example, where these barns are problematic to convert, but otherwise satisfy the sort of the intent of this. In other words, it gives a new use for the barn that makes it then a viable to keep that particular form. You can save the fabric by allowing its demolition and reconstruction, is what I'm saying. And if you don't allow it, then you lose the fabric because the barn falls down. So I guess I would vote then, or I would pitch that we find a way for cases like that to exist.
Go ahead.
I think that is a really good idea, and that's come up many times before. I think what we need to do is come up with language that says what you want to be there in the future. Do you want something that resembles the existing structure once the demolition and rebuilding occur? Or are you allowing anything to occur there? So I think that's an important aspect of this. But we've struggled with that over the years, and barns have, kind of fallen in as we've struggled with this. So I'm hoping that you're able to craft something.
I agree with Mr. Schreiber. I think we have other arrows in our quiver for historic preservation. And I think when we look at converted dwellings, it's about infill development, adding dwelling units in a way that makes sense from a land use perspective. And I would suggest, I don't even understand the causal reason for the 20%. I mean, I understand what you explained, Mr. Tucker, about the 20% and the 80%, but I don't really think we need that, because I can see a really dilapidated, not particularly worth preserving L on a house that should come down, and it might be 30%. So I think really looking at what's being proposed, or the context for maybe saving a barn or a carriage house. So I think we just arbitrarily picking numbers and almost using some of our section of our bylaw to maybe be like a growth control measure. Like a lot of things won't fit in here because we put these numbers in here, isn't the most logical way to look at land use proposals. So.
I guess I would, I agree with you on one level. I guess I would respond that part of the purpose of this amendment is to try and define what's the difference between a converted dwelling and something else. If you're going to go from a large, extended, rambling single family with attached barns and an outbuilding to 4 units with the addition of 25 to 50% more square footage, is that a conversion, or is that the creation of an apartment building? Where does part of the intent here is to say this is one of those, that's one of these, and make distinctions between these. I think, as you say, the scenario you describe might make perfect sense as an apartment use, come in under a use where that was appropriate. But if someone is seeking to do a converted dwelling for whatever reasons that best suit their needs, then we need to say that this is a converted dwelling, and here is how it is different from these other things. Here is how, for instance, here's the distinction between what a duplex is, which is largely new construction, whether it's the construction of 2 units at once or the addition of a new unit, including footprint, to an existing single-family residence, versus a conversion of a large single family, dividing it into 2 and making it into 2 units. The one is a duplex, and the second one is a conversion. So that's part of what we're trying to do here, is tease out what the distinctions are between the uses, so that there are enough options out there and that's what that summary page was before, to allow people to pursue whatever makes the most sense and what is allowed in the zoning districts where these are regulated.
I'm wondering if these 2 items should be separated. The existing house that can be divided into a number of dwelling units, and the detached structure that can be created as a new dwelling unit. I think they're really 2 different things, and perhaps in the old days when we wrote the bylaw initially, it made sense for them to be together, but I think now the 2 things are so different that it almost asks to be called 2 different things. Or maybe they're both converted dwellings, but there's a, heaven forbid that I'm going to say it, class 1 and class 2, or type 1 and type 2, or whatever you want to call it. But it seems like they are really 2 different kettles of fish, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, I think related to both what you were saying and what Mr. Tucker was saying, and what Ms. Greenbaum was saying, we shouldn't inadvertently set up a conflict between permitting bodies. It seems like under this converted dwelling, this 20% business, if we do not change a duplex to special permit, you could claim a duplex by doing 21% new construction by site plan review rather than special permit. So it seems to me that they need to be the same if there's going to be there's not going to be a distinction made between new building and attached building or whatever.
Currently, converted dwellings are by special permit in all of the residential districts.
Right, but if we say that if you want to change your single family home into a duplex, that's a conversion. But if you add 21% to it,
Yeah, you're in a convert,
then suddenly it's a duplex,
okay, yeah.
which is by site plan review. So I think they need to be the same, whichever they are.
Well, again, these are all moving
Yeah.
in parallel, and if the regulations, however they end up, for non-owner occupied duplexes, however we decide to configure that, change the special permit period, then they'll be consistent with the converted
Right,
dwelling,
right.
and there won't be that distinction. The distinction will instead be sort of architectural in a way, and dimensional. So it would be important to have one or the other considered first, and then the distinctions and the potential impacts, and these are all related, that is very true, made clear as we proceed through town meeting. If you vote this up or down, it has this ripple effect on the rest, and be aware of that as you're voting.
Mr. Fox?
John Fox, Precinct 10. I have enormous respect for how you're really struggling with these questions. They're really tough questions. But I'd like to propose a way of thinking about all of these as maybe the framework that you might use in trying to resolve these very detailed and tough questions. And that framework would be, when you think about RG, whether your goal is essentially to preserve RG as a family neighborhood. Because if that is not your goal, then all of these incremental changes may slow the transition to something else. But as you look ahead 20, 30, 40 years, it's probably going to look a lot like Lexington, Kentucky, or some other place, because the forces, the economic forces, the powers of investors to take over, to do the things that they want to do, be able to borrow, buy, and the rest, will gradually erode the RG neighborhood. It's inevitable. That's the power of money and the power of borrowing. So what I believe, and Ms. Kruger, you were talking about it, others have just suggested it, is that you really think about the outcomes of whatever it is you are thinking about enacting. So what are the consequences? How do they play out? Because you can have all these detailed rules, and you need some detailed rules, you really do. But if your goal is to make sure that you really preserve what is the historic character of Amherst, the RG areas, as essentially family neighborhoods with diversity, but essentially family neighborhoods, then I would suggest to you that as you think about each one of these provisions, that you say, does that encourage preservation of the family neighborhood, or does that permit the gradual erosion of the family neighborhood? And I realize it's not always black and white as to what those enactments are, but I think if you believe, as a lot of us do believe, that you're going to lose Amherst if you lose the essential family character of the RG neighborhood, that you then pose in your own minds the question as you address each one of these tough, detailed issues, which direction are we heading in? Does this help preserve it? Or do we find all sorts of reasons, arguments, rights, and all the rest, to say, no, we can't really help them here and we can't help them there? Because if that is your conclusion, 20, 30 years from now, people will look back and say, what was once there is no longer. So I encourage you to think in those terms. Thank you.
Does the board want to discuss any more, or
Really quick thing about the RG, I had meant to look this up before we met, and I'm wondering if for tonight's meeting with the planning board, if the staff could provide us with the zoning map in some scale. So, because when we talk about RG, I think people are mostly talking about Faring, Lincoln, missing the 3rd Street. And I think there's RG in some other parts, and I don't know, I don't have the data, if they're experiencing the same set of issues. So when we change something in RG, we may be changing something like on Kendrick Place that may not have a problem, where there's some 3 and 4 families that I don't think are problematic. So I don't know where, thank you, but I'd like to see it for our discussion, that's all.
We can certainly provide you with a map of the RG district for the planning board meeting if we end in time. The elves can go back in the kitchen and produce that. I don't think we would be able to give you the data
No, I did.
that you're
No,
discussing
obvious.
that quickly. We could, however, for your next meeting.
okay, go ahead.
I was involved in the case that unfortunately was about to be denied, or else we asked her to retract her permit, retract the application. But what had happened, this was a permit that had been granted in 1997 and not completed because she ran out of money. And the way it was granted in 1997 was that she had added porches to the outside such that there was a roof eave that made it more than the 500 square foot. The argument that came up why my buddies on the board wouldn't support it was that they didn't know what a footprint was. And so we had, in another case on Cosby Avenue, we had counted the roof overhang as part of the footprint. As an assessor, we know very clearly what's taxable, and that's considered the footprint, what's on the GIS on each property record card. But I had a hard time convincing the board what the footprint of the building was and why it was appropriate in 1997, and they said, well, that permit was granted in error. So I think you guys need to think about what the 300, 400, whatever square foot footprint you're talking about, what's included. To me, it's a no-brainer, but I couldn't convince them that. So the permit was, the application was withdrawn, and she's waiting for you guys to act, I hope.
Steve?
That's a really good point, because I actually missed the fact that it was exterior footprint, because I read that as heated in basically what would be considered habitable space, which would be the conditioned space inside the building. So I actually think that a better datum, because exterior footprint actually does require a brain.
In
Well, in other words, my definition of exterior footprint might be different than you. I'm not sure that's defined anywhere.
It's defined by the drip edge.
The drip edge.
The building commissioner would
Yeah.
define it as based by the drip edge.
But we
Of
haven't
the
had any
roof.
rain in a month.
Yeah, that's right. Climatological conditions notwithstanding. I think that the example that Ms. Greenbaum is citing is complicated by the fact that the applicant was at the same, had a smaller structure to begin with, and was, as part of her permit, also applying to create a porch that would bring her up to 500 square feet as the nominal exterior footprint. And it was the fact that she was trying to do everything at once that made things difficult. If she had gone ahead and put the porch on as she could with just a building permit ahead of time, and then come in with a 500 square foot footprint and applied, they would not have had the same difficulty.
Mr. Tucker, can you explain why we care if it's 400 or 500 or 300? I mean, is there
Back
a strong reason that's built in? Because I don't get the
now,
500.
why do we now have? I don't know that we now have a reason. When this was language was adopted in the late 80s, I believe, there was an attempt, because again, as usual, people were afraid that this would lead to runaway development of outbuildings. There was a decision made, or an assumption made, that this kind of conversion would only occur in the 3 densest existing residential districts. People went out and counted the outbuildings so that they could identify how many likely conversions there were, and the intent was to limit the number by limiting the size, by having it be of a minimum size. As I indicated, currently, there is a substantial movement in the other direction, saying that smaller in some circumstances is better. And I'm just, again, we're sort of throwing that on the table to say, okay, here are the pieces. What's your judgment about what makes more important? What is more important here?
Okay, yes, please.
Valerie Hetzel, I don't know what district I'm actually in. I mean, I'm RN. Right. To me, it would seem like the 500 square footprint doesn't really make 100% sense, because in my case, it was a 2-story building. So it's an 800 square foot living space, which is quite substantial for a single person like me. And so the 500 square foot, the addition of a porch was actually suggested by the 1997 ZBA to do that, to bring it up to that, which I had done in 1997. But because I didn't complete the building, my permit expired. So that's sort of the history. It's actually a 400 square foot building with a patio right now and pilings. No porch posts and no overhang. So just to clarify that for the record.
Thank you.
So we could conceivably, even if we decide not to change anything else about converted dwellings, we could elect to just change that number.
We could change that number. We could add, we could change it from exterior footprint to habitable space. We could do a number of things.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of like the idea of no number. Yeah, in other words, because there will be a minimum set up
Under the
by,
sanitary code.
yeah. And
Right.
so, yeah.
Is there anything more about you're past 6:30? Is there anything more about any of the other amendments that you want to address? If not, if I may suggest that you've already received them, but you've received some materials in your packet tonight that you didn't receive by email. I would recommend that you read them through and start developing lists of questions and so forth that will help you clarify how to go forward once the planning board has addressed this.
We,
We have someone who didn't realize that public comment would have to be, and she has a statement she'd like to make. She needs to leave shortly. Could you accommodate her?
sure, go ahead, please, whoever it is.
Thank you. My name is Priscilla White, and I am in Lincoln Avenue down by Fearing. And things really have changed in the last year in my neighborhood. And so I just wanted to, when you talked about the impact on neighborhood, just speak a little bit to that. I live, my undergraduate degree was from UMass, so I appreciate the education and the student body very much. I work at Hospice of the Fisher Home in North Amherst, so I work in town. And I live in a single-family home that has a supplemental apartment, which was a special permit of the zoning board, owner-occupied. That's the special permit. So in the front, the existing original 100-year-old structure, my daughter and her husband and my grandsons live, and I'm in the back in a supplemental apartment. And this year, this May, in the last few months, the house beside my house, which was owner-occupied as a single-family home, was sold to Mr. Singh. And as the neighbors were leaving, they came over to say goodbye, and so we wished them well and asked them about, do you know who's coming in? And they said, yes, in September, there are 6 students coming in, and They came and asked if they could put some of their belongings in the garage before we gave up our ownership. So we let them do that. And they came in and they drew straws for who would be in the dining room and who would be in the attic. So their understanding, what they shared with the exiting owners, was that 6 people have been renting under Eagle Crest management to occupy this single-family home. So that's to my left. Across the street, the multifamily owner-occupied property was also purchased by Mr. Singh. That owner told me that it was purchased 3 hours after it went on the market for cash. And an appeal was made to the zoning board to convert it to a duplex. And it's a non-conforming property. And luckily, the zoning board heard our community concerns, and that permit was denied. But there are students in there at this point. On the other side of me is an existing rental that changed ownership last year. And just to give you an example of ongoing problems, within the last week, there was a party there. It's also a non-conforming lot, so it's a special permit that it's a duplex. And there are 4 students on the first floor and 4 on the second. So we were hearing a bunch of people out there starting to plan, hey man, we're gonna have a party tonight, and lots of foul language accompanying that, which I'll spare you. And so my daughter went over and just said, hi, just want you to know that the new landlord has asked us to call him if there's a problem after 10 o'clock, and we're hoping this won't be a problem, but we just want you to know that, and also to call the police if there's a problem. There's a 3-generation family on one side of you, there are elders in the house on the other side of you, family across the street, so just keep that in mind. They said, okay, lady, sure, we'll be good. Then, got to be later, lots of people in the yard, in the house, loud noise, not music, but just because it's such a non-conforming spot, there are loud voices that continued until 1:30 in the morning, a football match on the street right in front of our house, and a lot of noise, people waking up. So, it's really hard. I have a very intense job doing this hospice work. I need to sleep well. I'm not trying to have a luxury of sleeping in till, but, a good 6 or 7 hours is really important to me and the quality of life of our family. And it really does change the impact of our neighborhood when these houses just flip and they're bought so quickly and converted into, I really liked your language about a commercial enterprise, because it really distinguishes between, sort of what you were talking about, a family that might rent to another family while you're attending to something else, versus people that buy up have a lot of these LLCs and wheeler dealer, and who can we get in, and how much can we put under the carpet. It's it's a very different animal. And it's been very, very difficult in the last few months to feel like our family can be a family. We have young boys and they're hearing this language. We could smell the marijuana out in the street. They had open cans of beer and they were loud. They were throwing a football back and forth. And they were just being kids, but they were clueless about how that impacts us as residents, as family members, trying to raise family, trying to be good workers, to do the best in our jobs. And the other thing is, I just wanted to say, I've made a commitment to do as much shopping as I can and frequent all of the downtown stores as I can. I buy my grandson's children's toys at the toy shop. I go right up and down Main Street and give them all my business. And we know that students don't do that. I mean, it really affects, I think, the business aspect of the town of Amherst as well as the neighborhoods, that we foster families who can be part of the workplace and support the businesses here. And someone also talked about the taxes, you know, as the property values go down, that all has an influence. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, before we adjourn, we ought to decide our next meeting. We have planning board meeting scheduled for the 15th. I presume the ZSC will also meet then. Do we want to meet on the 29th? Or not make that decision yet?
Given your workload, I would recommend that you do, not in any way to limit public comment, but I would guess that 2/5 of the time this evening, based on the planning board its last meeting tried to say we need to take the public comment during the planning board meeting so that the zoning subcommittee can get the work done. You just spent a certain amount of time being able to work and a certain amount of time listening, and that's not working. That hearing what effect these amendments might have is part of the work, but you can also hear that at the planning board meetings. So I would just both encourage you to have another meeting, even if you don't want to, and to try and focus on the work, because that's what you had said that you wanted to do.
Mr. Chair, I may not be able to be here on the 29th, which doesn't mean, go ahead.
I'm here.
Would you like to meet?
I can meet then.
Okay, so let's plan to meet unless we decide not to.
Excuse me, Stephen said he could be here?
Yes.
Okay, so I guess we'll adjourn for 14 minutes.
Thank you all very much.
Is there an actual kitchen back there?
It's down in the basement with a microwave, but Chris could take you down